Eugene, I've learned so much and I try to tell it to other people, but it's like people rather go down the same road that you went down before they learn. You make mistakes through life. It's like mistakes is always there. You make a lot of mistakes with your life, but when you somehow blow your kid's life, you always think about it.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm especially delighted that Christopher Hedges is here with me. I'm a great admirer, as I know many of you are, of his extraordinary contributions as a writer in both this issue and also on American military issues and the health of the democracy and the compromised health of the democracy. So I'm thrilled. I've never been here with you. I've never been with you in person before. I'm a fan from a distance, so having you watch the movie means a lot to me. So maybe we'll start with comments.
I'll just get up and make a few comments. I'll stand if it's all right. First of all, it's a great film. And I and Celia Chazelle have been teaching now in prisons for several years. This fall, I taught a class at Rahway, which is a maximum security prison. And that was the first time I had been at Wagner, and I know some of you work in Wagner. I've seen Princeton students at Wagner. Rahway is different. It's an older population. The sentences are longer. I had a lot of lifers in there, people who had been on death row. Before I got to the prison, a lot of the inmates found out that, or actually there were copies of my books. It was quite moving on the first day. Very tattered copies of a few of my books appeared that prisoners wanted me to sign. And so I got all of the great writers of the prison concentrated in my class. And I had toyed with the idea of writing a play. We read August Wilson, Amira Baraka, Dutchman, Leroy Jones then, the McNally plays, the brother-sister plays, James Baldwin. And I toyed with the idea of getting them to write a play. And so every week we wrote scenes. And I remember that first week I came home with 28 scenes, and it blew my mind. I had 5 or 6 incredibly talented writers that became the engine for this remarkable play that we ended up finishing in December called Caged. And I just found out about 10 days ago that the Culture Project in New York in the fall of their season of 2015 is going to mount the entire production. And last Friday night, I went back to the prison and told them, and it's their voice. And the first question they had was, can our families go? And I said, I don't know where I'm going to get the money, but I'm going to have buses in Newark, and they're going to take your families to see that play. I'm going to read, just before we begin, a couple, very short. I'm going to read you the dedication, and I'm going to read you their own bios, which are only a couple sentences. This is what they wrote for the dedication of their play. We have been buried alive behind these walls for years, often decades. Most of the outside world has abandoned us, but a few friends and family have never forgotten that we are human beings and worthy of life. It is to them, our saints, that we dedicate this play. These are the bios. Lawrence, Camden, 24 years in prison, eligible for parole at age 70, in 2045, arrested at the age of 14. Gene, 30 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2014, Navy veteran. He served as a hospital corpsman, the father of 7 children. Leonardo, 13 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2022 at age 53, the father of a beautiful girl and boy. Thomas, 23 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2021 at age 51, son of Zubaria Bandi and Willa Dollard. Ronnie, 2 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2032 at age 55, never been married, no children, graduated from high school in 1995. Boris, New Brunswick, 11 years in prison. Eligible for parole in 2015 at age 40. Father of 4. Assistant Director of the New Directions Program for Prisoners. Shahid, Newark, 16 years in prison. Eligible for parole in 2016 at age 38. Arrested at the age of 18. Jacinto, Willingboro, 28 years in prison. Eligible for parole in 2015 at age 56. Ex-father, ex-husband, ex-soldier, U.S. Army, 11 years on death row. Devon, Newark, 11 years in prison. Eligible for parole at 2017 at the age of 37. For my son, Javon, I've changed for you. For my mother, Kathy Holloman. For my beautiful wife, Amira Hubbard Holloman, loyalty is royalty. Reggie Patterson, 17 years in prison. Eligible for parole in 2037 at the age of 68. Father of Pilar, son of Mary. Sentenced to a prison term of life plus 40 years, 115 years, with a 50-year parole ineligibility. Brian, 11 years in prison. Eligible for parole in 2028 at age 50. Was once lost and without hope, but found hope through the blood of Jesus. Anthony Plainfield, 18 years in prison. Release date, 2029 at age 52. Arrested at the age of 18. Learned to read and write in prison at 20. Self-taught musician, wrote the music for the play. James Elizabeth, 21 years in prison. Eligible for parole in 2024 at age 55. I am a Muslim striving to get closer to Allah as I continue to fight to regain freedom, to be a better leader for my family during these days and times. Robert, Newark, 11 years in prison. Release date 2019, at age 34, arrested at the age of 18. Found freedom behind bars. Domingo Patterson, 24 years in prison, serving 30 years to life, eligible for parole in 2021, president of Lifers Group, writes poetry. Omar, Newark, 14 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2016 at age 35, arrested at the age of 18. Sammy, Newark, 21 years in prison on a 45-year to life sentence, eligible for parole in 2033 at age 63, hopes one day to do prison ministry. Samuel, Queens, 21 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2023 at age 47, arrested at the age of 17, a son, an uncle, a husband, the father of a little girl, and a proud Puerto Rican. Fernando Trenton, 12 years in prison, eligible for parole at 2018 at age 36, arrested at the age of 19, looks forward to the day he can again be with his beautiful mother, Annie. David, Brooklyn, 28 years in prison, a 12-year veteran of the Air Force, eligible for parole in 2025, the father of 2 wonderful children. Habib, Newark, 15 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2024 at age 45, the father of Kayla, a Muslim. Timmy Patterson, 19 years in prison, conceived a rape in South Carolina, raised back and forth between the calm of the country and Patterson, eligible for parole in 2025 at age 52, arrested at the age of 20. Marvin Irvington, 22 years in prison, Army veteran, eligible for parole in 2020, the father of Natanza Spears. Hashem, Newark, 22 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2021, from the 7th Avenue Projects, father of Nadia, son of Marie. Razula, Atlantic City, 23 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2024 at age 55, father of 3, Samira, Stuart, Shamik, and Sean. Hector, Newark, 24 years in prison, eligible for parole in 2019 at age 47, arrested at the age of 17. I counted up the years, and in my class of 28, they had spent 550 years in prison.
What I think I'll do is just share a few thoughts very briefly about the life of the movie right now, which I hope in concert with Christopher's comments gives you some time to contemplate what thoughts or comments you might want to make, any questions you have for either of us. But I do think it bears talking a little bit about, the film is really a portrait of a journey that I made over several years along with my team across what ended up being about 25 states that we looked at and investigated and sought human stories to try to bring a human face to this horrendous conflict and its consequences. But that was one story, and it's the story documented on screen. What's not on screen is what we've done with the film ever since, which has in many ways been an almost more shattering and in many ways, I would say, finally slightly hope-inspiring journey. And that has been the journey that's made possible these days in some part by changes in the way movies are released to the public. There's a great theatrician, Bert States, who talked about great reckonings in little rooms. And when I was at Princeton as a student, that was taught to us in theater classes as kind of an identifying framework, an identifying concept for understanding what do we do sitting in a theater, sitting cheek by jowl, in the darkness, watching something in front of us. And it was a very beautiful notion that I left college with, that I would go off and make first plays, I thought, and then ultimately movies. And there was this communal collectivist notion that we all sit cheek by jowl and we watch something that perhaps animates us to want to become more civically engaged. And so we all go out into the night and, of course, grab our pitchforks and march on the Capitol. You remember doing this, right? Every night? But in fact, later in my life, I decided in the small town I live in Vermont to own a movie theater. And I'd gotten to watch people come to the movies, movie after movie, movie after movie. And by and large, we don't get to show any serious movies because Americans have their brains so dominated by circus rather than serious content coming out of our corporate-controlled media empire, which is a reflection in many ways of the sort of denigration of the American soul. And so I sit there as the strange owner of a purveyor of such circus, and people come in, and every now and then we do slide a movie like mine or movies of serious content in, and we try to see whether anyone notices, whether they leave the theater and think something's wrong with the projector or go get popcorn repeatedly. But you do find that the public has actually quite an interest in it, notwithstanding what Hollywood would want us to think otherwise. And so I started to lose my religion when I saw people in droves starting to go only to circus movies and not enough to serious movies, and then ultimately watching them start to watch these movies on their small screens. And again, this all relates back to what it's like to be on the road with a movie, trying to secure social change, trying to promote social change on any subject of significance in a country where the airwaves are so dominated by the prurient. And so what I found that was so fascinating was, first I rejected these small screens, and I thought, oh, if people go and they don't come really to the theater to watch my movie, but they watch it on all these little digital platforms, what a tragic loss, because that cheek-by-jowl experience doesn't happen. We don't get that collectivist town hall, great reckoning in a little room. Instead, we get actually an environment that feeds the individuation that is the lifeblood of destructive capitalism, keeping us one from the other, separating us, rather than making us community, making us individuals who can be pandered to, catered to, hoodwinked, embroiled in addictions and other quick fixes. So I didn't like that I was participating in that with my movie. It seemed so counterproductive until I noticed a strange phenomenon, that with these small technologies, A, that we make the film with, and B, that we now can distribute the film with, there's been a vast democratization of what people get to watch. We know this from the crazy stuff that gets sent to us in our inbox, from videos of some cat playing the piano to something more funny or more serious. But that democratization, the wildfire spread of ideas and of bizarre little pieces of communication, is something which has caught up the capacity to promote documentary ideas as well. And so suddenly what you find is, A, there's a tremendously wide reach. People may not be coming to my movie theater, but a giant swath of the public is being reached by documentaries through those technological channels of digital showing. But the other side of that is when people get to the end of the film, instead of going through the illusion that they're going to grab a pitchfork and go out in the night, when what they really do is go to Thomas Sweet's or Ben & Jerry's or whatever it is that gets the steam out of their system, and they then go home to sleep, and they think, oh, I did my political job, I watched a movie, or I watched Jon Stewart, that was my politics for the week. Instead of that rather hapless and kind of feckless experience, instead they often click. They often say, I want to join the movement, I want to learn more, I want to join the other people participating in this. And of course, that's all well and good, but a mouse click is just a mouse click. No revolution has yet been built on mouse clicks. And it's quite a dangerous illusion, I think, to think that, I heard the term, somebody said to me the other day in an audience, they asked me how I felt about clicktivism, a little mingling of clicking and activism. And I said I hadn't heard the term, I didn't know that it was sweeping the nation, but it certainly would be perilous if it did, because it suggests that there is an activism end in itself in the mouse click. Of course, the mouse click is only supposed to create conditions where a group like Spear, who I'm very delighted has this here tonight, and I do want to thank my nephew Maxim Jarecki, who connected me to Spear and made this possible. I'm very proud of Maxon for the way in which he does real boots-on-the-ground work. Went over to India to help people with their water and takes this kind of thing seriously, as a lot of people in his generation do, who understand that there's life beyond the mouse click, that you need to click the mouse, and it needs to then lead you to places where we appear as you're doing here tonight. And that's where the second part of the digital revolution has made it possible on my tour across the country to try to impact the legal system. And I have to say we have, with the film, been somewhat impactful. There are individual states where we used the film to go after individual laws and made changes in those laws. We watched it happen in California, where we made changes in the law. New York, where we were instrumental in contributing to the efforts of groups on the ground like the ACLU, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, the Drug Policy Alliance, and other very meaningful groups you should know about and can be helpful to. We made the film available in many states to try to change laws and change behaviors and misguided policies, but we also got it seen on Capitol Hill and in the White House, in the Office of the Drug Czar, the Justice Department, and as well by the President himself. And in their changing of the laws, which the President and the Attorney General have thankfully begun to do, they actually quoted the film, and it was an incredibly gratifying experience for us. But it wasn't, I think, so much of the film's good looks. I think it was because we're in a new era where suddenly a film can end up snuck into the White House because you have such an amazing diaspora of ways that people are seeing the film. And there's nothing more gratifying for me than being on the road, meeting with audiences. I'm especially fond of being here because it's my alma mater. But last night was in Pennsylvania. The night before that I was in New Hampshire. And these kind of tourings around the country have taken me to 45 states to try to change the laws. And we're having a real impact. I'm proud to say we won the Peabody Award yesterday for the film. And one of the things that does, it's sort of the highest journalism honor you can get in the country for televised journalism, and it gives the film sort of a good stamp to keep doing the life it does, and awards are mind-numbingly admired in America beyond my comprehension why that's the case, but so it is, and we use the currency of the realm. But it does tell you one thing. It tells you that in the many problems we face, of which the prison industrial complex is only one culprit of the many predatory complexes that are hijacking American policy at the expense of ordinary people, the prospects for the planet writ large, and the prospects for life on Earth. Of all those, the military-industrial complex is something that Christopher and I have both written a great deal about and worked a great deal about. We see the prison-industrial complex. We have so many industrial complexes doing so much damage. And yet right now what I find is that we have suddenly the ability, with this very sort of perhaps fleeting moment, to get out there and find that there are people who are redistributing, in a certain sense, the center of gravity of the democracy. Because the Peabody Award tells us that people have lost confidence in conventional media. They've lost confidence in what they used to trust about journalism. And so some hack like me, who isn't even working for a journalistic institution, I'm an individual, just like Chris is an individual, and ultimately finds ourselves having to do the work we do very often in an independent space, and then seeing what journalistic enterprise will have the courage to take it out. You may have heard that the Sunday Times of London wrote to a journalist who had sent in photos from the conflict in Syria, and they rejected the photos. And when he asked why they were rejecting the photos, they said, "You're in a zone that our insurance doesn't cover." And so when you have journalistic enterprise in the world being compromised by capitalism, like it is eroding and on the attack on so many aspects of life, maybe it falls to everyday people to redistribute democracy and to retake the center of gravity in the democracy. And so I get out there with my movie. I go to prisons, I go to churches, I go to schools and state houses all over the country, but everyday people come out as well and they say, maybe there has to be a better way to run the country and it won't happen from the top down. So it's been an extraordinary experience around the country, and I'd happily talk about that, but I see us on, for the first time, a slightly good foot in the history of the tragic war on drugs. And so I'd love to take any comments or questions or thoughts that any of you have, and I once again thank everyone for having us. How did the project get funded? Traditionally, my movies have been hard to fund in the United States because our public broadcasting system suffers from the fact that our commercial broadcasting system tilts so desperately to the right that it becomes very hard for public broadcasting to operate outside of a culture of fear of being seen as counter to the wishes of those in power. And so the public broadcasting system is as balanced as it gets, but even it is skittish about material that might be too controversial. So generally I go abroad to get my funding. The BBC is the source funder. It's the original funder of most of my work. And I then go to other public broadcasters in foreign countries like Arte, which is the French-German public broadcasting conglomerate, NHK in Japan, SBS in Australia, different networks. But the interesting thing with the house I live in was that partly owing to the fact that I'd made a couple of films that were seen as serious and worthy enough, I was able to get more interest in this subject than in previous films. So we were able to bring it to public television and, in fact, make a case. I was pitching a film that unmitigatedly talked about that we would make comparisons to other periods of persecution in history, even genocides and the like. So they didn't buy into something and have me sneak up on them. To their great credit, public television, at great risk to their sponsors and their controllers, advocated for the film and funded the film to a good degree. About a fifth of the film's funding came, therefore, through public television. About two-thirds of the rest came from international broadcasters, and then the remainder came from foundations. The Ford Foundation was one, the Wincote Foundation was another, Bill Scheide, a Princetonian funder, was another additional funder, and we sort of pounded the pavement. George Soros' Open Society Institute was also a very serious funder. Yes?
A lot of the film is based in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And I presume you're aware, last month the new director of the Oklahoma prison system banned cameras and audio recording devices.
Yeah.
He said it's a security measure, and that the media would be allowed in still, but only with pen and paper. So I'd like to ask both of you what your reactions or thoughts were to that tragedy.
Well, that already happened in Pennsylvania to prohibit Mumia Abu-Jamal from being filmed or communicating. And when I saw Mumia, I wasn't even allowed a pen and paper. In New Jersey, the laws are phenomenally restrictive. And I think that, one of the fascinating aspects of writing this play, which is pretty raw, is that eventually the prison authorities got wind of it and started pulling members of my class out individually and interrogating them about what was in it. And they would come to the class and go, well, is it because there's cursing? And what they couldn't fathom is that the reality of mass incarceration is something that everyone within the system knows intimately, the guards and the prisoners, but the people on the outside don't. And they don't want the people on the outside to know. And so I think that we will see a move to be more restrictive as you get independent filmmakers and journalists and others who attempt to burrow inside the system and explain it. It's very difficult as a journalist for me to get in the prison. I have been trying to go to Maryland to see Sundiat Al-Khali, who is one of our nation's about 150 political prisoners, former member of the Black Liberation Army. And these people are never getting out, these Panthers and stuff. And I can't. So, I mean, I think that the system, our democratic system is so broken at this point, and we just saw the Supreme Court ruling and this grotesque spectacle of Sheldon Adelson, calling Republican candidates to pay court. I think we have just seen under the Obama administration that it almost doesn't matter what the public wants, what the citizen wants, what rights they have, and we can talk about wholesale surveillance. It's corporations and lobbyists who rule, and these lobbyists are going down and writing the laws because they know what's good for business. Corrections Corp of America, they spend a lot of money in Washington. So, I was a supporter of another Princeton graduate, Ralph Nader. I wrote his speeches for him in 2008 because I think that, and I think Eugene even addressed this in the film, and I was also very supportive and active in the Occupy movement because I think we have to begin to build mass movements. That's the only hope left, and that will include many issues, including mass incarceration.
To reflect on Oklahoma in specific is important to give you my experience around the prison system in the country writ large, but I've spent a good bit of time in Oklahoma. To make the film, we shot in prisons in about 8 states. Since that time, I've been in prisons in 30 states. And I have now, the film is now standardized viewing in 7 states in all prisons. New Mexico is the most recent state to give us access with the film to every prison in the state. Now you ask yourself, this is bizarre. Why are states showing this to their prisoners? I think part of that has to do with the particular approach we take. Part of it has to do with the film being finished and they can view it and they don't find it inflammatory within the world of corrections. Because a lot of corrections people, let's not talk about the draconian director of Corrections of Oklahoma for a moment, but I'll get to him in a moment. What happens is that in other states, they watch the film and it resonates for a lot of people in corrections because they feel, whether or not they agree with the drug war, the way I portray it, they are aware that they are on the losing end of the equation. Correction person after correction person told me, look, if you're at this long enough, after you get your hot-blooded first couple of years out of the way, where you're like a knuckle-dragging prison guard, you try to figure out what you're doing with your life, and if you're doing anything, you're trying to put out a better product than you got in. They use this weird Reagan-esque money language for human beings, but they say you're trying to turn out a better product than you received. And they can't do that without programs. But what they see is that tough-on-crime politicians pandering to the public and pandering ultimately to their corporate paymasters, what they do is write tougher and tougher laws that put more and more people behind bars for longer. So they flood the corrections people with incoming bodies, leaving the corrections people then needing to build more facilities, put in more beds, and then they take away from them the very budgets that they have for preventing recidivism. So carpentry shops, air conditioning repair, faith and character programs that teach ideas like integrity, things that people never got in the broken inner cities and forsaken heartland. The prison, very often you have pretty good people working in those prisons now and then who really are trying to do it, and they say, we just get the losing end of the game, and then they point to us as if we're the reason that the recidivism rates are so high. So I honestly find kindred spirits all over the landscape because people are in a bell curve of human nature, and you find jerks and you find wonderful, hardworking people. So I never generalize across the prison landscape in America, but there is no question that there are pockets of severity that are astounding. And to tell you one small anecdote about the directorship of the Department of Corrections of Oklahoma, the previous director, Justin Jones, was an amazing figure who I only got to kind of by climbing the ranks. I began with underlings, and I kept finding one amazing person in the Oklahoma prison system after another. People who would tell me things like that extraordinary security chief, Mike Carpenter. And I kept thinking, how is this possible? How do you all think like this? And they said, well, we're all the protege of a man named Justin Jones. You got to meet him. He's the director. You'll love him. And I sit with Justin Jones, who goes on a rant with me about the disastrous immorality of the privatization of prisons. He's the director of corrections. And so we dwell on that for a little while, and he's outspoken more than anyone you saw in the film. I didn't put him in the film for a specific reason that I'll get into. But he talked, and it was heartbreakingly smart and beautiful and meaningful, and it gave me hope for humanity. And then he said, but understand that we would have a totally predatory and cannibalistic prison system in America without one private prison. That is a grand distraction, because the immorality that we have in our prison system has profit all over it, even when it's the public system, because jobs depend on it, because food service companies are employed, because the lights need to be run, the factories are putting out the materiel for it. And so he turned out to be an amazing ally in using me, in a way, to become someone who could look very closely at a system that he was prevailing over, but had deep misgivings about. While we were making the film, we had access everywhere. After we finished the film, the access started to dry up, and I contacted Justin, and I said, I'm coming down to Oklahoma, and This American Life wants to do a piece on what I do in the prisons. And This American Life was going to come with me to a prison, watch me show the film to prisoners, and then they were going to do something I had never done. It was super cool, and they did it. They sat prisoner A, with prison guard B, talk to each other about the drug war. So they had unbelievable conversations on This American Life between prisoners and the guards. That was going on, and at that same weekend, I got a call from 60 Minutes that they wanted to do a privatization piece. And so I said, well, if I got the guy for you, I have an insider at the highest level of a state's correction system, and he will weigh in that privatization is akin to the Nazis. It's as bad as it gets. It's corporate fascism as the Nazi definition of fascism began. So he'll talk to you about that. You won't believe it. So they sent their guys down, and on the way, I get a call from Justin Jones, and he says, I know I've agreed to talk to 60 Minutes. And he was very skittish. And I maintained control of the 60 Minutes broadcast. I held him hostage. And I kept saying to them, I will force you to behave, because I won't hang out a guy who's a profoundly committed reformer. I won't make him your whistleblower of the week. So I'm in between you and him. And I kept playing interference. So Justin called me and said, I'm concerned about appearing. And I said, oh God, I think they're already on the plane. I said, why? He said, because I've just found out that I'm being fired this week. He said, well, I don't know if I'm really being fired, but the governor has made clear that she'd like me to leave. And I said, when's that? He said, on Tuesday. I said, well, we're coming to interview you on Monday. You'll still have your job. I said, this is fantastic news. You think this is bad news? 60 Minutes will love this. I mean, the day after we interviewed Justin Jones, in fact, he was relieved of his post by the governor of the state. Why? Because it's her intention to privatize all prisons in Oklahoma. It's an incredible situation. So they come down and they interview him, and I have an argument with Justin Jones, who I adore, and I adore him to this day. We're very, very close friends now. And I said to him over the weekend, I said, so how's it going to go this week? They're going to interview you, then when's she going to fire you? And he goes, oh, well, she's not going to fire me. I will resign. I said, explain this to me? Well, it's in politics for me to let her, force her to fire me. I'll resign. I said, Justin, if you don't force her to fire you, the public has no idea why you're resigning. They need to know writ large why she's firing you, that you're a moral man whose track record is actually quite draconian of all things, but not enough for her and not corporate draconian enough for her. Let her come out and say that. No, he says, my inmates to whom I am very loyal and my staff to whom I am very loyal, they will read my behavior on my departure very, very closely. And they'll know exactly what it means if I look like I'm going under protest, and you could have prison riots all over my state. Within what I do, Eugene, this is how I have to do it. And I said, but we'll never change the world if whistleblowers like you let them not fire you. And you elect to resign, and for all I know, you had a dirty habit or something. And I tried like hell. I had a 2-hour late-night phone call with him, and he resigned on Tuesday. And so everything has followed that, and I have some malaise in my heart of wondering, are we in some measure at all the reason it's dried up down there? I don't think so, because Mike Carpenter, who was chief of one prison, got promoted after this film to be security chief of this state. I think they're on a different matter simply about their privatization goals. They don't want to let cameras in, and then the cameras get used to being there, and they get the announcement that everything's going private.
I'll just throw in, you could have never done that in New Jersey, right, Celia?
Never. Much more impossible.
Never. Yeah. I mean, this state is really awful.
Yeah, in fact, that North-South idea that the South is like what you want, boy, and the North is like so warm and fuzzy. The toughest, most racist prisons I have been in America are in upstate New York, where I was told when I met Anthony Johnson, you will not touch the prisoner. There should be no physical contact between yourself and the prisoner. This guy's arrested on a minor drug charge. I mean, he's not Jeffrey Dahmer. So I sit down to talk to Anthony, and I reach out to shake his hand, forgetting, because you see another human being, you think you shake their hand. And he goes, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot. And I said, well, Anthony, just so you know, I'm shaking your hand in my mind. And he said, I'm shaking your hand in my mind too. And we were, like that. Yes, you were next.
This question is for Eugene. I was wondering at what point you wanted to put yourself in the film and why?
Never is the first answer. Second answer, I don't know. To be honest with you, I was making a film that I've never had myself in a film before. And I always would find, what is a pudgy, comfortable white guy doing in a film about the incredible predation against poor black people? And why would I possibly take a moment of screen time away from the full evolution of the story, even from race to class and all of that? So I never would have put myself in the film, and the original design of the film did not have me in it. It was kind of like The Wire, which I've never seen, but I've been told that it's an outflowing of story. I hadn't seen any of it when I made the film. I just thought, I'm going to show pieces of lives, fragments of lives, and I'll let them unfold and accrue to a dystopia, a picture of terrible wrongdoing that you'd get sort of just through dint of storytelling and of human experience. And I had finished a version of the film, and I contacted Harry Belafonte, who was a supporter of mine in other ways and of the film and an extraordinary American hero, and I brought him in to look at a cut And I pushed play, and the movie played for about 25 minutes. And 25 minutes in, he leaned forward and he whispered in my ear, he said, "Could you stop the cut, please?" And I pretended not to hear him, because honestly, you don't really want to show your film to Harry Belafonte and have him ask you to stop it under any circumstance, because he's not going to say, "This film is so great that I asked you to stop it." So I pretended not to hear him, and again he leaned forward and he said to me, "Could you stop the cut, please?" And I paused it, and he said, "Where are you going with this?" And I said, "Well, it kind of plays out. Right now I know it may look to you like a kind of a hawkish look at cops busting perps and judges locking them up and throwing away the key, and jailers, dealing with." I said, "But it'll kind of unfold, and I don't want to cheat and jump you ahead, but the movie ultimately makes the argument that this drug war is kind of a form of genocide, so I think you can stay tuned." And he said, "I appreciate that, but I don't know that I'll get there at this rate, because you're showing me scenes that I find profoundly reprehensible without comment, and it's disconcerting." Now, to be fair to me, there is a way of making documentaries that is visceral and experiential like that, and does not sort of lead from opinion. It leads from experience and lets you conclude, and I felt that's what I was doing. But to some degree, I also understood that I had a very vast tapestry in front of me that I wanted to paint. It was quite arbitrarily chosen out of my own experience and the distillate of literature plus experience plus experts plus personal stories, such an amalgam of things that to organize it on screen was a task, and I didn't feel satisfied we'd organize it. So I started to think, well, what do? Do I put that British accent guy that all the BBC films have? So like, Raphael, that's not going to work, like some bizarre, post-colonial colonialism. So that wasn't going to work. Then the question was, well, or I could do, what am I going to do, a black Morgan Freeman? I mean, that's usually the go-to, is like, oh, it's about black people, go get poor Morgan Freeman. His phone is ear is ringing every time something has to do. It's just, typecasting, so I didn't want that. I didn't know what to do, and this and that. And then at a certain point, someone proposed from the outside, another viewer, said, late in the film, Nanie Jeter keeps calling you Eugene. And I said, yes, I figured the audience would start to figure out that one of the people in the film seems to know this Eugene, and maybe he's the filmmaker. I didn't look when I came in, but, oh, yeah, he's the filmmaker. Yeah, okay. So she knows him. Oh, there's a personal link. And I liked that was an emergent narrative, as we'd call it, not a nail-on-the-head narrative. But they said, if you're going to do it then, why don't you do it at the beginning? And you have a personal stake in this thing. And my team was like, there were a whole bunch of very self-conscious white people who were very aware we were making a film largely about a plight of black people and what role would I have. They were very sensitive, as much as I was, to those issues. And then it seemed like the better part of valor to actually frame it by my own experience, my family's experience, and the special calling that we felt growing up as children of refugee Jews to spread the notion that Never Again was not just about Jewish people. And then if I could frame it that way with as few words as possible, which is not my skill, and get off screen as quickly as possible, and leave it to the people who are most deeply affected, then at least it would organizedly have brought people to the place where they could appreciate those stories without puzzlement. So it was a pained decision. But when I stand at the back, except for the fact I don't like my voice, like nobody likes their voice, I'm comfortable that it was the technique we used. And honestly, as a love letter to Mrs. Jeter, who loves the film, and it was very meaningful for her to know that I was, apart from what I was trying to do with audiences, apart from what I was trying to do with the drug war, I was saying to her, I understand the price that you paid, that I was able to benefit from the time I had with you, and there, but for the grace of God, go I. And I think it meant a great deal to her, and I think maybe without my voice in the film, it would have been a more abstract experience that wasn't really a dear loved one letter and a statement of love. So it helped that too. Yes, in the checkered shirt.
This isn't my question, but how have you not seen The Wire?
Yeah. I now have seen quite a bit of it, but I hadn't at the time. And once I figured out what it was about, and once I started working with David, I don't know if Chris has this, but I don't like looking to my right and left when I'm trying to do something, because you either find something that you wish you had done and now you feel like you can't do it, or you feel like you'll be copying it, or it just ruins everything. It's better for me to have blinders on.
Sorry. Yeah. If either of you could speak to the issue of the history of the drug war in Latin America, and how with an effort to engender a campaign, you also keep an eye on the more transnational dimensions of the problem, and particularly with the question of Latinos becoming, within the question of forced migration and the incarceration of Latinos, which unfortunately didn't fare too much in your film, right. And the majority, which will be Latinos in I don't know how many years. How do you not alienate that population as well as the rest of the continent in your advocacy work?
Well, just in terms of Mexico, it's NAFTA. So you push through NAFTA, you drive, we don't know, 3 to 5 million Mexican farmers off their land because agribusinesses can undersell them. That increases migration. It creates the same kind of breakdown in Mexican communities that you see in the inner city with all the attendant problems. It's why, the killings and the rise of the drug lords in northern Mexico took place in the same way it takes place in Camden or Newark. I mean, it's global capitalism is a phenomena that doesn't respect borders at all and is rapidly creating a global, not just a national, but a global neo-feudalism of masters and serfs. And in many ways, and I guess Eugene can talk about this too, I mean, in many ways, I think what you see in northern Mexico is, for the same reason, precisely what you're seeing in poor pockets of the United States. Superfluous labor, forced into the underground economy to survive, with a rise of chaotic, almost anarchic violence on the part of both law enforcement and a criminal class.
And for me, the absence of Mexico in my film is a woeful absence. And it was, in the end, a calculated choice on my part. We had edited long sections where I had done tremendous research about the drug war in Mexico. But apart from the fact that it's called the drug war, and apart from the fact that it is a result of our drug war, and we are the direct engine for why Mexico has had this crisis afflict its land. Say again? Yes, but I'm focused on Mexico for the purposes of this comment, because we could go to Colombia and everything else, but I was pointedly aware that the drug war raging in Mexico right now was absent from the film. There's one comment that Anderson Cooper makes about Mexico in the film. And when I finished it, it was a decision that I couldn't do a whole other war. I couldn't do that and also do a good job on this, and I sort of vowed to myself that I would deal with Mexico in a subsequent film with the specifics of both its internal dynamics and the incredibly corrosive impact that we have had on Mexico, dating back all the way to Plan Colombia and what we did to reroute drugs by blocking through Plan Colombia. You understand that, I'm sure you do, but many people don't know, and I didn't, that what had been happening when cocaine was coming from Colombia, the Plan Colombia and our arrangements with the Colombian government and the incredible efforts by Clinton and his predecessors to block the drugs coming through Florida, what it did was it routed the drugs through Mexico, which embroiled Mexico in the drug trade. So the Plan Colombia, which was complained about by activists for a million reasons, had a secondary blowback, which was to funnel drugs through Mexico and create a courier nation out of Mexico. And then what happened is that the courier nation suddenly gave rise to cartels within it, because they started to say, instead of paying me for this courier activity, give me a piece of it. And now you had dealership going on in Mexico. And so not only did the Mexicans have the affliction of NAFTA and the incredibly subversive economic crimes that the United States spearheaded against the Mexican people, but then on top of that, you now had them becoming afflicted, but as an almost casualty, a sort of collateral damage of the drugs on their way north, as they would afflict Mexicans, intoxicate them, and thereby suborn them to the new cottage industry of the cartel drug trade. So what I've now tried to do in my own work is that one of my upcoming films is a film set in Ciudad Juarez, and it does deal very pointedly with this issue, because it was the only thing I could do to deal with the woe I felt of leaving it out. But I thought, if you want to stop the Mexican drug war, you unplug the American drug war, because the American drug war revolves around one ridiculous idea, which is the idea that these drugs were treated as a criminal matter rather than a matter of public health. What that brought, of course, was an escalation in the price. And if you have an escalation of the price, it is worth dying for. And you create this extraordinary race to the bottom in that country, which then combines with what Chris talked about in the disenfranchisement of the country, where you become the only game in town. And young Mexicans would rather die in a blaze of gunfire by 22 and at least have a moment in the sun than live the completely denigrated life that we've collaborated with the Mexican government to give them. And so now you have this incredible cauldron of disaster. And as Chuck Bowden, who's the guy with the very deep voice in the film who says all those pithy things, he said to me, he goes, the incredible thing, he says, about this trafficking at the border and the way in which Americans view the Mexican situation is they have a complete lack of understanding of the way in which we are the origins of the Mexican drug problem, of the Mexican drug war. We like to think it's almost an endemic Mexican mess. We characterize the Mexicans in already so many racist ways of disorganization and kind of chaos that this is just another fruit of that.
Well, it's interesting that the prisoners are fascinated by white-collar crime and what Wall Street has done. I mean, because they catch that disparity. And we've destroyed the legal system. We've created a two-tiered legal system where, for the elites, they write their own laws, they write their own regulations. Goldman Sachs can commit verifiable fraud and remains not only unpunished, but gets basically 0% interest loans from the Federal Reserve. And that's very frightening because what you've created is an elite that can't be touched by the law. And I mean, this gets into economic theory, Carl Polanyi and even Marx, that unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. It has no self-imposed limits. It commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. We see that with the fossil fuel industry. They're the very death throes of the planet are an opportunity for profit. And at the same time, in these marginal communities, we have created on the ground omnipotent police forces, which Eugene illustrated so well in the film. And Hannah Arendt, in Origins of Totalitarianism, writes about the danger of the creation of omnipotent police forces vis-a-vis the stateless. She herself had fled Germany and was stateless. And she said that when you create these omnipotent police forces, i.e., people can be stopped, many people in my class, some of them did horrible things without question. But there's no question that whatever percentage, I don't know, but there are people in there who were completely railroaded. They're stacked with charges, most of which are absurd, and then if they don't plea out, the pressure is to get them to plea out. And I mean, the percentages are staggering. And please, what's it, almost 90%? 90%. So, for instance, in this class...
It's like saying that the courtrooms in federal court buildings and in state court buildings barely get used. All of the deal-making is happening in bathrooms and lobbies and stairwells.
And it's done in 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah. So, I mean, I have in the class a guy who had been on the U.S. Army boxing team and was about to go pro. And he got picked up for something he didn't do. And I work with a group of ex-prisoners in Elizabeth, so that's where he's from. I mean, the story is famous. And he wouldn't plea out, because if he pled out for 10 years, his boxing career would have been over. And because he wouldn't plea out, they hit him with 30 years. That's an example of how broken the legal system is, both from top to bottom. And Arendt writes that the danger is that when you create these omnipotent police forces that are essentially beyond the law, that are capable of doing anything, and I think, again, Eugene's film captures this, then as society begins to experience in a period of instability or unrest, suddenly these omnipotent police forces, which are already sanctioned under law, appear everywhere. And you're seeing it now, as Eugene pointed out, in poor rural white communities in the meth, with the meth epidemic. And we are seeing that among activists, among Occupy activists. You know, the fact is that the Occupy movement was heavily dependent on electronic forms of communication, which worked really well at the time. But what it did, because of the wholesale surveillance, is identify them to the state. And the sort of unreported story is that all of these activists are now being neutralized. So we have court case after court case. I mean, I'll just give you one that I'm involved in. One of the activists was picked up with a pair of scissors in his hand in Zuccotti and charged with assault with a deadly weapon against a police officer. And they filmed Zuccotti 24 hours a day, but they didn't have film of that. They wouldn't let him plea out because he was in the courtroom. They said he was on the Homeland Terrorism Security List. And then finally what they did is give him 5 years of probation, which essentially means that he can't do any activism because otherwise he's going to slap with that 7. That is now happening across the country. So I think that, you know, the decay within the judicial system, both at the lower levels and at the higher levels, is one that's become, you know, extremely frightening.
I'll tell you an interesting vantage point I have on it, because we show the film in many prisons in the country. We do these quite remarkable prison screenings that are life-changing for me, because I get to show this kind of information to inmates who are directly concerned in it. And there was one particular screening. It was the first time this ever happened, but it's now become a ritual I go through in almost every screening. A gentleman who was in the prison for a long sentence, a 43-year sentence, stood up at one point, and he said to me that he was moved by the film, and he said, "What can I do?" And I was absolutely stopped by it, because I get that question in art houses around the country. I get it at universities. I get it, and often it means from somebody who's a person of some comfort enough and some concern that they've gone out to watch a documentary for the night. They might mean, what can I do between dropping the kids at school and Pilates or something like that? Like, what can I click? Where can I send some money? What can I do in that way? And here's this person in a jail cell. He's about to go to solitary. I mean, what could I tell him to do? Bang your head against the, you know, what are the options? And I said to him, I'm amazed by the question, and I find it really inspiring. I'm at some peril answering you, so I'm going to answer very carefully, because I'm not in your shoes, and I can't tell you what to do. But I can tell you how I see you. I stand here today looking out over this sea of prisoners. We're about 600 men in the room. And I said, I see how you're all seated. And it's the same in every prison I go to. You're all seated by race. So the white guys are all sitting together, the sort of Aryan types. The black people are all sitting together, Chicanos, natives, Latinos, so forth. So groupings are all seated together. And they separate and they keep apart from one another in the gymnasium, in lunch, in all these life ways. And I said, and you guys have your own reasons for doing that. You've got gang reasons, you've got personal reasons. I'm not going to get into that. But you should know that while you do that, the system is laughing at you, because it's precisely what the system would like you to be doing. The system wants to separate you into a pen of sheep and a pen of goats, and they want the goats to think that the sheep are the problem, and the sheep should think that the goats are the problem. Now, in fact, I said, the real problem is the shepherd. The shepherd is the problem. At this point, the guards started to get nervous, so I quickly reached out to them and I said, guards, don't get nervous. To be clear, you're not the shepherd. Guards, let me ask you a question. How many of you have a relative in here? All the hands went up. How many of you have a friend from high school in here? Most of the hands went up. I said, how many of you, in addition to your salary from the Department of Corrections, are on food stamps? All the hands went up. And I said, so prisoners, they don't have the power to be the shepherd. They're a stone's throw from you guys, but they happen to be on the giving end rather than the receiving end. I said, you may now think I'll move to the warden, that he's the shepherd. But the warden is the one who brought me here today. He's the reason you're watching this film. He thought it was worthy for you to spend your afternoon watching the film. So the warden's not the shepherd either. I said, let me give you a hint about who the shepherd is. The 400 richest people in this country now have more money than the bottom 150 million. Bears repeating. 400 people have more money than 150 million at the bottom. First of all, I don't believe you can have a democracy in that context. I think anyone who purports that you can have a democracy in that context is expressing contempt for the word democracy. Because the attendant power and the differential in influence that goes with 400 people having that concentration of wealth and 150 million people scrambling for food stamps, that speaks for itself. I cannot imagine that's democratic. But to return to the room, I said, the way that that 400 and the corporate sector that it represents works is that it has hijacked your government in every avenue of American life that you can imagine. So it has a pharmaceutical industrial complex that makes drugs impossible to buy for people and holds them away from people who need them and makes an industry out of something that ought to be a public right. The military industrial complex that cannibalizes human lives for hobby wars that are cooked up in conjunction with defense manufacturers and worse, the KBRs and the Blackwaters of the world that actually need battle to survive. They run on an ongoing bloodbath. And so they are concocting laws, and that is cannibalizing public policy and our young men and women in national treasure. And then you move to the insurance lobby, which has made it so that people are uninsured and it's unaffordable. Then you move to the banking sector that, as you mentioned, Americans are aware that the banking sector stole billions from the American people, including from grandmothers who now can't eat, and they got nothing but a slap in the hand in the press. When 10 blocks from here, a little past Race Street down there, there's a kid getting pulled over by a New Jersey cop tonight, they're going to find an ounce of something in his pocket that he didn't get from a doctor, and he's going to get 5 to 40. This bizarre dystopia has resulted, in my view, from America having lost its way over several decades, and lost its way particularly since the end of World War II till now, when this extraordinary wholesale industrialization has happened. And so where it takes control of public policy and profit becomes a higher virtue than morality, becomes a higher virtue than human dignity, than human rights, and then democracy. And so when I returned to the room, I said, so the shepherd is this problem. And you have to understand that your only way of going up against the shepherd is to stop fighting with each other about race. Because that's all you can do in here. Because when you fight about race, two things happen. The first one is you actually damage each other's lives. Because when you have that fight, you actually put more violence in both of your jackets, so that when you come up for parole, you get reviewed and you have more violence in your jacket and you get denied. So you're literally expanding the time that one another are going to spend in here, and you're adding bed nights that can be charted as profit to the prison industrialists. They ought to send you a gift at Christmas time for extending their profits by fighting with one another. So if you want to keep fighting, make sure you know that you have now become a proud supporter of those companies that are profiting from it. The second thing is that your families come here, and when they come here, you tell them all about the black guy across the hall who's causing you grief, or the white guy who you cut at lunchtime because he said the wrong thing, and you guys are at each other's throats, and your families get wind of this, and they walk away with such a message. The message they're supposed to walk away from, which goes to the heart of your question, is that we represent the persecuted poor. The people in these prisons are the persecuted poor of the country. And those people who are on the outside, there are more than 30 million Americans that have a loved one in the system. If all of them came to understand that that group was a persecuted poor, notwithstanding race, that's a voting bloc. That'd be 30 million people who could push public policy in the directions it wants. So it's a huge question, and the disparity is a very workable one. It's something you should talk about all the time. And when you speak with your friends, you have to keep them aware of this grotesque disparity, because it highlights that we have essentially created a concentration structure for the persecuted poor in the country.
The traditional mechanisms of reform work anymore. That the piecemeal and incremental reform that was made possible by a liberal class, it's gone. The liberal class is gone. It's been replaced by a faux liberal class, embodied in figures like Clinton or Obama. It was Clinton who gave us NAFTA. It was Clinton who destroyed the welfare system, and at the time 70% of the recipients were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC and turned the airwaves over to roughly a half dozen corporations: Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Clear Channel. It was Clinton that destroyed Glass-Steagall and ripped down the firewalls between investment and commercial banks, precipitating both the national and the global financial crisis. And it was Clinton that gave us the omnibus bill. which exploded the prison population. And why? Because Clinton understood that by doing corporate bidding, he would get corporate money. And by the 1990s, the Democratic Party, which had once been a home to at least that traditional liberal class, which, as Chomsky points out, is never designed to be the political left. It's designed to be the kind of safety valve to ameliorate suffering, as Roosevelt did during the New Deal, although he would take the agendas of more radical parties like the Progressive Party and others. And Roosevelt says, my greatest achievement was that I saved capitalism. And Roosevelt's right. But now that is gone. I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which spends a lot more time talking about this. And in a way, you have to go back to Marx, because the system is so myopic that built within it, as Marx pointed out, is the seeds of its own self-annihilation, which is precisely where we are. So if you take the Occupy movement, the grievances that were addressed in terms of inequality, in terms of work, in terms of student loans, which throws most college students into an untenable debt peonage, which is a form of social control, as African Americans in this country have experienced since emancipation. It was a mainstream movement. And the response of the state was to physically eradicate, under the direction of Barack Obama, all of those encampments. Now that for me was a very chilling sign. And I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years. I covered all of most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, both Palestinian uprisings, the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. So as a reporter, I'm very attuned to the kindling that ignites social unrest. So Krugman will write about a rational response. And he's right in that sense, that a rational response would have been a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, and a rational healthcare system, i.e. The public option or universal healthcare for all. That would have been rational, but it didn't do that. It spoke exclusively in the language of force, and now there is this subterranean war across the country against those within the Occupy movement, which never, in terms of numbers, I don't think it ever exceeded about 300,000 people. But we are watching across the country these people being neutralized by the state through the wholesale surveillance, courtesy of Edward Snowden, that we now know was going on. And that always means that because the state cannot respond rationally, and because corporations have no self-imposed limit, that they will just grab more and more and more, eventually there will be blowback. But what frightens me, as somebody who comes out of the left, is that all of the populist and radical movements that opened up the spaces in this democracy, the Liberty Party, the labor movement, the suffragists, the civil, they've all been destroyed. I mean, in a way that is not in Europe. There's still a residue of it in Europe. And what we have in terms of funding and organization are proto-fascist movements. The lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, the Christian right, which we cannot discount, homegrown militias. And America is a deeply violent culture, and these people speak in the language of traditional fascism. They celebrate violence, they fuse the iconography and language of the state with religion, and they have demonized the vulnerable. Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists, a very long list of people they despise. And you can't take that rhetoric lightly in a time of social turmoil. I covered Yugoslavia. I watched the propaganda campaigns that eventually created that fratricide in Yugoslavia. So something's going to happen. What will happen? There will be an eruption. Will it call itself Occupy? Will it look like Occupy? Probably not. I mean, the lesson that I learned covering movements is that what ignites it is unknowable, unforeseeable, and often benign. And that even the purported leaders of movements never know when it's going to happen. So on February 9th, 1989, I was in Leipzig with the leaders of the East German opposition, the people who organized the opposition that brought down Honecker. And they said, maybe within a year we will have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. But even that was a very important lesson for me. So something's coming. What, how, we don't know. It's always the ruling elite that determines the configurations of rebellion. And they are going to push. I mean, look what they've done. They've slashed food stamps. Our chronic unemployment and underemployment is staggering. The LA Times said we have an unemployment rate of 17%. When you count people who have stopped looking for work and are no longer counted in the system, or you count people, the working poor, people who have a job but their income puts them below the poverty line. And I think that's why, I don't know. I mean, things are stacked against us. I'm talking about on the ground. But the only hope left is to build mass movements of such a degree and that can be sustained that we can begin to put pressure on these corporate forces, which Eugene ticked them off. But in essence, what has happened is we have undergone a corporate coup d'etat. And we just saw another example of that with the Supreme Court ruling on the unlimited campaign finance by figures like Adelson. And I mean, we haven't even discussed the environmental crisis, but it's intimately twinned with the economic crisis. They know, I mean, 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts, and Shell Oil looks at it as a business opportunity. I have 4 kids, and I don't like going to jail. It's more time than I care to donate to the U.S. government, frankly. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs, by the way, which, I know they recruit on this campus, or they're all over there having drinks at Ivy. That is your responsibility to call them out when they come to your campus. I mean, they are the largest commodity index traders in the world, and I covered the famines in the Sudan. I know what it means when they jack up the prices of wheat to make profit. It means children starve to death and die. And that was, my impetus for sitting down in front of the doors of Goldman Sachs until we were taken away. So, I mean, as a father, I don't think it does any good to be Pollyannish or engage in an Oprah-like hope that's an illusion. I think we have to face the reality that's in front of us. But as a father, even if I fail, I want my kids to say that he tried. And it's your generation that's going to pay the price for our crimes. And it's incumbent upon you not to be seduced, which is very easy to do at a school like Princeton, by these very elite forces that, I speak as a former seminarian, are in theological terms forces of death.
I mean, that's so profound, I don't really want to add to it. It covers a great deal of how I think, and I have more sort of practical considerations on how to go about it all. I'd rather leave it with what Chris said. So maybe we'll take one more question. Is that cool with you? Young woman there, yeah. You in that row, yeah.
So I know that there's a lot of students who are interested in filmmaking, in journalism, and even if we're not, we're going to be talking to people about the problems of mass incarceration, and we're going to be talking about the populations that are disproportionately incarcerated, the communities that are disproportionately affected by this. And I was wondering what your approach was in dealing with a film that talks about people who have been traditionally portrayed in a certain way in the media, and what kinds of things did you have in mind when you were talking about this group that really doesn't have a voice in America?
There were 2 elements to how we thought about dealing with the matter of race in the film. On the one hand, it was clear to me that you could not understand the profound depravity of the history of the drug war without understanding how decidedly an African American tragedy it has been, a tragedy for the African American community. However, it was also important to put that in an historical context that would include the way in which, as a pattern of behavior, the United States, as other countries have done, but the United States has done it with a special kind of ferocity and with a special kind of roving eye, in a way, the way in which the American government and state governments have used contraband laws kind of as thinly veiled laws of racial and social control, so that instead of saying, I don't like this person, they're Chinese, therefore I'll put them in jail, you create a sort of a law focused on an activity you can associate with Chineseness, and then there you go. And then you do it with Mexico, and you say that hemp is now marijuana, sounds kind of Spanish, let's put him in jail, and so forth. And so we've seen this kind of, that was the translation, that the translation happened to Mexicanize hemp, and to make it what they then called, which was Mexican opium, they called it at the time. So in a sense, I wanted to put that pattern partly so that Black Americans would be able to understand, and collective Americans would be able to understand the way in which the Black experience fits into a long pattern that writ large really says that there has long been a corrupt way in which the laws get hijacked and this kind of crazy result happens. The second way that we wanted to portray it, though, was that I was pointedly aware that one of the ways to make Americans focus on this, and this should not be the case, it should be the case that the masses of people should have said the Iraq War is criminal on its face. There were no WMDs on their face. Those who launched it lied to the American people, and in so doing killed thousands of Americans, maimed hundreds of thousands more, and killed hundreds of thousands of foreigners. And I believe those are war crimes. I think by any standardized definition in international relations, those were war crimes, and it should be enough that Americans say, our leaders committed war crimes in broad daylight. What were we thinking? Let's have an accountability hearing. Instead, Americans seem to say only, oh, I started to figure out that the war was wrong when I lost my uncle or my brother. It's a heartbreaking reflection on the condition of the American sense of morality that we link it to our own backyard. We don't anymore play Madison and Jefferson and ask, where does human dignity lie writ large? Where does our obligation as a country, as a leader among equals? That's heartbreaking, but it is the case, and I have to play in the currency of the realm. And so the movie sought to let the full story of what's happening in the drug war, which is the shift from race to class, unfold. And so I was able to try to portray, look, this is a racial story that has now evolved into a class story, because when Nixon sort of unleashed the hounds of the war by calling it a war on drugs, and I give credit to Nixon where it's due, because he's frankly far more progressive than Obama and anyone else operating today, which is an amazing thing to be able to say, I guess, about Obama, but also about Nixon. But he unleashed it, and when it was declared a war, all of a sudden the dogs of war got unleashed. And the dogs of war are all of the things we see with military-industrial corruption, vested interests, profiteering, all that. And so now something that had been an ad hoc series of racist laws, a sequence of just sort of impulse racism, now got codified into an economically driven machinery of war that consumes human beings for profit. All those industrial complexes put profit before people. None other than the military-industrial complex so directly feeds human beings into a machine and dollars come out the other end. And the idea that that's one of the largest businesses in America and such a vast employer, there are 2.3 million Americans in jail, but 7 million under correctional control, 7 million people. Right? So you start to think about numbers that truly rank with some of the history's most prominent persecutions. So I wanted to tell that full story so that Americans would say what Charles Ogletree says, which is, this is coming to a theater near you. This is not just other people that it's affecting. And I almost didn't want to say that, because you ought to care per se. But if it helps, I'll add in that you're next. So it was
just to throw out on Nixon, he was the last liberal president, not because he was a liberal or had a conscience, but because he was scared of movements. And there's that scene in Kissinger's memoirs, Don't Go By the Book, where Kissinger and Nixon are looking at through the window of the White House at a huge anti-war demonstration. Nixon has taken empty buses end to end to ring the White House, and he's wringing his hands going, Henry, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that is where you want people in power to be, as Karl Popper has pointed out in The Enemies in Open Societies. Power is the problem. In terms of journalism, let me speak as somebody who spent 15 years at the New York Times, where the unwritten motto of the New York Times is, do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for access and power. You can alienate them sometimes, but not all the time. And the really good reporters, Sidney Schanberg and others, who just won't let up. Sidney went after the real estate developers who have now destroyed Manhattan. But these developers were all the friends of the publisher. And Sidney, who had won, you may have ever saw The Killing Fields, it was about him, and he was pushed out, like a lot of other good reporters. But all great journalism is almost never done by the mainstream. It's done by people like Eugene, who are not serving or not trying to sort of placate commercial interests on whom they depend for money, or people in power on whom they depend for access. And access for a paper like the New York Times is very important. So in the 1960s, you have Ramparts magazine, run by Bob Scheer, who runs the website Truthdig I write for, out of LA. So Ramparts never makes a dime. Bob, who's never made a dime in his life, always has great financial schemes. And the one for Ramparts was that he took an ad from the back of Time magazine for Pan Am and put it on the back of Ramparts, thinking that other advertisers would think he was respectable and then maybe he could get advertising. And the only thing he got was that Pan Am sued him to take the ad off of the back of Ramparts. But Ramparts exposed COINTELPRO. Ramparts printed that iconic photo of the girl burned by napalm, the naked girl running down the road. And Martin Luther King was sitting in an airport with Ralph Abernathy and opened Ramparts and saw that picture and pushed his food away. And Abernathy said, "Is there something wrong with your food?" And King said, "Nothing's going to taste right till I get up and denounce this war." And you can go back through the history of American journalism. I.W. Wells, the great crusader against lynching, who exposed that lynching had nothing to do with black men very rarely raping white women, that it was a reign of terror, with her newspaper office being burned down in Memphis. I.F. Stone, blacklisted by McCarthy, couldn't even get a job at The Nation magazine, starts I.F. Stone's Weekly in his basement. And those forces have always put pressure on traditional commercial media to do their job. And that's how it works. They don't get credit for it. So, journalism has been reconfigured with the decline of newsprint. And that monopoly that that the newsprint had connecting sellers with buyers is gone. I mean, now we're all profiled on Google. And so, whatever you look at on eBay or anything else is going to pop up on your screen. And that means that that ability to be a mainstream journalist and collect a middle-class salary is over, despite what journalism schools are telling you. If you go out and do journalism, you are going to be a member of the working class. You are not going to be able, as I was, to make a very comfortable New York Times salary with benefits. Those days are gone. And it means, in essence, that journalism, like the arts, like the humanities, are being pushed to the margins of society. Anything that has the capacity to speak to truth or beauty or transformation in a corporate state, as in all totalitarian states, are being crushed. And you see it at state universities where they depend on state budgets. And departments have to raise their own money. Well, it's very hard to do that if you're in the classics department or the philosophy department. All these departments that teach you how to think rather than what to think. I often worry that even where it exists in places like Princeton, it becomes almost a kind of boutique kind of refinement before you go off to work for Goldman Sachs. As somebody comes steeped in the humanities and sees its vital importance, and steeped in journalism, and my wife went to Juilliard and is an actor, I mean, you just see how that is crushed, and in essence, we're robbed of the language by which we can examine and express our own reality, and I think that's conscious. I think it's on purpose.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for joined me tonight. It's a wonderful thing to listen to. Some of the things you said tonight are so searing in my heart and brain. I'm blessed to have heard you, and thank you. And really thank you to Spear and to the community here for having us. Please do tell your friends about the movie, and you can visit our website at thehouseiliveit.org. And at that site, it's very importantly designed because you can enter your zip code wherever you're from, or here in Princeton. You can enter the zip code, and it'll tell you in any state in the country what the issues are that are facing each state under the drug war and who's doing what about them. And it gives you operational ways that you can join, become supportive, whether by steering financial support to the key groups doing the work in the state, or by being boots on the ground yourselves and showing up. It even has an events page for each state where it talks about what the upcoming events, and we work very hard to keep that very current for people so that they do have a do something at the end of the process, that they can become hooked in this. And I have to tell you, when you start to understand how connected it is to the very essence of the democracy, it really does become motivating to understand that this war, this particular area of American life, is vulnerable to reform. I've often said when I do television interviews, I've never had a vulnerable adversary before in anything I've fought in American life, and I've already seen that this thing is vulnerable, and I actually think we'll watch the significant change of the war on drugs on our watch. What horror it will be replaced by remains for us to be vigilant about, but it is meaningful to call it quits with this extraordinary abuse of human life. So thank you very much.
Can I just say something to the students? I know there are students here who work in Wagner, and as a reporter who spent all of his career in the developing world, building those relationships, real relationships with the oppressed, especially if you come out of a community of privilege, as we do, is absolutely vital. And somebody spoke about despair, which is real. I mean, you'd have to be very ignorant not to be in despair. And yet, when you build those relationships, such as when I walk out of Rahway, you can't betray those people. You carry their voice. And I think that what will keep you vital and what will keep you passionate and what will keep you from succumbing to cynicism is building real relationships with people who have not had your privilege. And that was true in my own career, whether it was in Gaza, whether it was in El Salvador, whether it was in the Sudan, wherever it was, or now in prison, or the last book I wrote with Joe Sacco was in the poorest pockets of the United States, including Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the country. Keep those relationships alive. And if you keep them alive and you carry that pain of the oppressed within you, then you'll never give up, because what's driving you is, in the end, and I think what drove Eugene's film, and that's love.
Yet despite a few first steps toward reform, those experienced with criminal justice know it will take more than experts, activists, and a handful of courageous lawmakers to undo the damage that decades of drug laws have caused.
Understand that the political infrastructure is so wedded to the status quo, that they're so consumed with the next election, that there will never emerge a shred of leadership that will change the situation. It's up to us.
What do we want? When do we want it? No longer can drug laws serve as a stimulus package for prison communities on the back of poor people.
My takeaway from the past 15 years isn't that we need to wait until we get consensus. It's that we need to do what's right. If there are people like this body who are the sentencing experts that are supposed to tell Congress and tell the public what the right thing to do is, I just urge you to do it.
I believe it is in the interest of every American that we thoroughly examine our entire criminal justice system.
You need to care about that person down the block, because the same rights that they have, you have. And if you let their rights be compromised, your rights are compromised. At some point, you have to stand up and say, it's not okay.
If there's anything ever going to be done about this is going to change. It's going to have to come from the people out there. Going to have to help.